I'm Elena. I'm 31 years old. And this is the story of how my older brother stole everything our father left me, and how I took it all back without ever raising my voice. When I was 24, I watched him forge a will with the arrogance of someone who thought I was too soft, too quiet, too forgettable to fight back. But what he didn't realize was that I never forgot. Not the sound of the pen as he signed our father's name, not the smug way he smiled when he told me life isn't fair. I waited. I studied. I learned. And when the moment came, I didn't shout, I didn't scream, I just pulled the right threads. And I watched his entire life unravel. I can still hear it. The soft scratch of the pen against thick legal paper, echoing louder in my memory than it ever did in real life. It wasn't even the first time I heard that sound, but it was the first time it made my blood run cold. When David, standing in our father's study with that smug tilt to his chin, slid the document across the table and told me, "Dad changed everything." My eyes traced the signature, our father's name, too perfectly written, too smooth, like a copy pasted from a memory instead of a living hand. I was still numb from the funeral, the scent of old books and aftershave still hanging in the air like a ghost, but in that moment, something inside me snapped into clarity. He didn't look at me with grief, he looked at me like a man who had already won. And I just stood there, letting the silence hang, letting him believe he'd broken me. But even then, even in that moment, I knew. I wasn't going to fight him then. I was going to wait. Let him build. Let him believe. And then? I'd take it all back, quietly, piece by piece. Letting David believe he'd won wasn't hard, he'd been trained for it since we were kids. He was always the golden boy, the one who could do no wrong, with that effortless charm that made teachers, neighbors, and even our dad blind to his arrogance. Meanwhile, I lived in the background, in the soft quiet of corners and closed doors, a ghost child who only existed when something needed cleaning or fixing. Our dad tried to be fair, I think. He came to my school plays, asked about my grades, but his eyes always sparkled brighter when David walked into a room. David, with his football trophies, his easy lies, his ability to make the worst things sound like harmless mistakes. I remember one summer when David crashed Dad's prized vintage motorcycle, totaled it, and Dad just sighed and said, "Boys will be boys." I got grounded for a week for forgetting to mow the lawn. It wasn't that Dad didn't love me. It was that he couldn't see past David's glow. And David? He saw that. He learned early that he could get away with anything, and he did, over and over. So by the time he forged the will, it wasn't a new trick. It was just the grand finale in a lifetime of getting exactly what he wanted. But the thing about always winning is that you never learn how to see a storm coming, especially not one that creeps in quietly, after years of silence. The storm came just weeks later, not the one I was planning, but the one that changed everything. It was early autumn, the leaves just starting to crisp at the edges, when I got the call from David. Dad had died in his sleep. Heart failure, sudden but not entirely unexpected. He'd been tired for months, quieter than usual, but still stubbornly independent, mowing his own lawn, polishing his classic cars every Sunday, refusing to let anyone treat him like an old man. I remember staring at the phone long after the call ended, my brain trying to stitch those words into reality. Gone. Just like that. I drove to the house, our house, and walked into a space frozen in time, slippers by the door, coffee cup in the sink, the smell of motor oil and cedar in the air. David was already there, already moving like he owned the place, giving instructions to the funeral director, adjusting details like a man preparing a show. But when I found Dad's armchair still warm, a book open on the side table with his reading glasses resting on top, something inside me broke in a way David could never understand. He cried for the audience, I wept in silence. Not because I needed attention, but because the man who raised me, flawed, blind, but still my father, was gone. And the space he left behind would become the battleground David thought he'd already won. It didn't take long for the mask to slip. Just 2 weeks after the funeral, we met at Dad's lawyer's office, a quiet place tucked between a bakery and a thrift store, nothing fancy, just the kind of office where fairness had lived for decades. But instead of the usual will, the one Dad always talked about, split down the middle, no drama, David showed up with something new, something recently updated, something he claimed Dad had drawn up just a few months before his death. I still remember the way he casually tossed the thick packet onto the desk like it was trash, then leaned back with that smug half-smile I'd come to hate. This new will left everything to him, the house, the cars, the lake property, even Dad's savings. I stared at it, trying to breathe through the fire climbing up my throat. The witnesses? Two of David's high school buddies, guys I hadn't seen since they were drinking under the bleachers and getting into fights. And the lawyer listed on the bottom? A man David played poker with on Wednesday nights. I looked at the signature and felt ice wrap around my spine. Too clean. Too perfect. Too convenient. Dad had been sick, but not stupid. He would never do this. Not unless someone helped his pen move. David saw my expression and said, "I know it's hard. But this is what Dad wanted." That was the moment I knew he wasn't just selfish, he was a liar, and a bold one. And if he thought I was going to vanish quietly, he didn't understand who he'd just stolen from. But vanish I did, at least on the surface. The same day the fraudulent will was accepted by David's shady lawyer friend, I packed what little I had left into a single duffel bag and walked out of the house I'd called home my entire life. No fight, no drama, no begging. David didn't even bother to say goodbye. He was too busy taking measurements for new furniture, telling a contractor how he planned to knock out the back wall to open up the view. I moved into a damp basement room I found through a grad student housing forum, the kind of place where the pipes groaned louder than the people. I slept under exposed beams and beside a washer that never stopped rattling, staring up at the ceiling wondering how everything could be taken from me just because someone scribbled my father's name on a piece of paper. David, meanwhile, started renting out the lake property on weekends and posted photos of himself standing in front of Dad's Corvette like he was some self-made mogul. It burned. God, it burned. But while he posted, I studied. While he celebrated, I listened. And while he spent the inheritance like it would never run out, I began quietly building something stronger than a confrontation. I started building a plan. The first cracks in David's lie came from the people he thought were too dumb, or too loyal, to talk. I started with the lawyer, the one whose name sat crookedly in Times New Roman on the last page of the forged will. A quick background check pulled up exactly what I expected, not a partner in any firm, no published cases, and more importantly, a suspension from the bar 3 years prior for ethical inconsistencies, a polite way of saying he was known for looking the other way if you slipped him enough cash. I dug deeper and found photos of him and David on the same poker nights, arms slung around each other like college frat bros, drunk and grinning. Then I moved on to the witnesses. It took months, but I tracked one down on Facebook, a guy named Ricky, who looked like life had chewed him up and spit him into a trailer park. I messaged him, posing as a legal researcher, and after some coaxing, and a promise that he wouldn't get in trouble if he told the truth, he casually admitted on a call that he never actually saw anyone sign anything, just helped David out, you know? I saved that audio clip like it was gold. Because it was. Each word, each timestamp, each digital fingerprint, they were bricks I'd used to build a case David wouldn't see coming. He thought he'd tied everything up in a neat little bow, surrounded by idiots who owed him favors. What he didn't realize was that his perfect little con was already bleeding at the edges. I didn't have money to fight David, not then. What I had was time. Time between late-night study sessions and early morning commutes. Time in that freezing basement room where the radiator wheezed like an asthmatic ghost. Time to trace every name, every date, every signature in that will he thought would bury me. I couldn't afford a lawyer, but I could research case law until my eyes ached. I couldn't hire a private investigator, but I knew how to comb through digital breadcrumbs, how to dig into metadata, how to map out timelines that didn't add up. My anger was fuel, but it never spilled out. I kept it pressed into notebooks and spreadsheets, hidden in folders buried under coursework and fake file names. Meanwhile, David kept winning. He bought a new SUV, posted vacation pictures from the lake house, and bragged online about flipping a property he never even paid for. Friends called him brilliant. His in-laws toasted him. But I saw what they didn't, the rotting beams under all his polish. I knew this kind of fraud didn't age well. I just had to be patient. Because while David was spending his fortune, I was investing in something far more dangerous. The truth, sharpened and silent, waiting for the perfect moment to cut. That truth needed a blade, and I knew exactly how to forge one. I enrolled in a master's program in information systems with a focus on cybersecurity and digital forensics, telling everyone it was just a smart career move. And it was, but not for the reasons they thought. Every lecture on document authenticity, every lab on metadata extraction, every case study about digital fraud felt like another piece of armor sliding into place. I learned how to read between the bytes, how to uncover the fingerprints people leave without ever touching a thing. While David was drinking cocktails on the lake house deck I should have inherited, I was sitting in server rooms pulling late-night assignments on digital chain of custody protocols. Every new skill wasn't just academic, it was personal. I wasn't just building a resume, I was building a weapon. And as I crossed that graduation stage, smiling for photos with my borrowed cap and rented gown, I knew the real work was only beginning. Because now? I wasn't just a wronged sibling. I was someone with credentials, access, and a growing arsenal of tools. And soon, I'd use them to make sure David regretted every smug word and stolen dollar. While I was quietly sharpening my tools, David was doing exactly what I knew he would, flaunting his throne like he'd earned it. He moved into our dad's house like royalty, repainting the walls in loud, trendy colors, tearing out the bookshelves Dad had built by hand, and replacing everything that felt like home with glossy, shallow showpieces. He had a housewarming party less than 6 months after the funeral, catered, of course, and invited people who barely knew our father but were happy to toast David's incredible work ethic. He started a real estate career with startup capital he never earned, built a portfolio off the inheritance he stole, and bragged on social media about his latest deals like he was the next mogul in the making. The cherry on top? He bought a boat and named it Big D's Dream, complete with a custom decal and champagne photo shoot. Every post, every smirk, every inflated story made me sicker than the last, not just because of the injustice, but because no one seemed to question it. No one wondered how a man with average grades, no savings, and a history of almosts had suddenly leveled up overnight. But I didn't comment, didn't argue. I liked the photos, even smiled at mutual friends' comments. Because the higher he climbed, the harder he'd fall, and I wanted him to believe he was untouchable right up until the second everything shattered. And climb he did, straight into a marriage that looked perfect on paper, but from the moment I met her, I knew Hannah was the crack he'd never see coming. She was sharp but soft-spoken, warm in a way that made people lean in, and far too grounded to fall for David's illusions forever. At their engagement dinner, I sat across from her and watched as she smiled politely at his overblown stories, her fingers tightening slightly around her wine glass every time he interrupted her or spoke over her thoughts. She didn't know yet, not fully, what kind of man she was marrying, but I could see the questions already forming in her eyes. I kept my distance, never hinting at what I knew, but I paid attention. At the wedding, she pulled me aside and said softly, "You're the quiet one, huh?" I just smiled and said, "Someone has to be." And from that moment on, I knew she saw more than David realized. While he was busy building his fake empire, I watched as Hannah started asking subtle questions at family dinners, as she gently challenged his spending habits, as she quietly set up her own bank account just in case. She was no fool, she was observant, cautious, and slowly peeling back the layers of a man built on lies. And when the time came, I knew she'd be ready. Because sometimes the most dangerous allies are the ones already living inside the enemy's walls. While Hannah quietly began to sense the truth behind her husband's facade, I focused on what David had always underestimated, the digital traces he left behind. One weekend, when I was alone in my basement apartment, I pulled out the scanned copy of the updated will he'd emailed me years ago, the one I'd saved under a fake label and never touched until I had the tools to dissect it. Opening it now was like peeling open a crime scene. And the moment I extracted the metadata, my heart started pounding. The file had been created not in any law office, but on a laptop registered to David, and worse, it was timestamped the morning after our father died. That alone was damning, but there was more. The version history showed multiple edits in the same 48-hour window, each one bringing the wording closer to what David had claimed was Dad's voice. It was like watching a mask being sculpted, one keystroke at a time. I made a forensic copy, stored backups in multiple encrypted folders, and started building a digital chain of custody. David thought that once he printed the document, it existed only in the physical world, ink and paper, signatures and witnesses. But in reality, the ghost of every lie he typed still lived inside the code. And now? That ghost belonged to me. With the digital ghost secured, I turned my attention back to the living ones, the witnesses David had enlisted to prop up his lie. Ricky, the first one I'd tracked down, had already slipped once during a casual call. But now that I had the tools, I reached out again, not as a legal researcher this time, but as someone who knew exactly where to push. I scheduled a call under the guise of needing a signed statement for some estate clarification, and before I even got to the hard questions, Ricky, clearly anxious and stumbling over his words, admitted that he never really saw the will being signed. He said it like it wasn't even a big deal, like he was remembering a half-forgotten party trick. "David just told me what to say, you know?" Said his dad was too tired to sign in front of us, but it was all fine. I didn't interrupt. I let him talk. I recorded every second, every phrase of casual deceit. When I asked him point blank if he saw our father sign it with his own eyes, he hesitated just long enough to seal his fate. No, he finally said. But we were helping out, right? Helping out. Like forging a man's legacy was doing a friend a favor. I thanked him calmly, ended the call, and backed up the audio 3 times. That recording was more than just a confession, it was the moment the lie stopped being airtight. And I knew once I opened that crack wide enough, the whole damn thing would start to collapse. With Ricky's confession locked and archived, I turned my sights to the man whose name gave the forgery its false legitimacy, the so-called lawyer who had handled the updated will. It didn't take long to confirm my suspicions. His license had been suspended before and was currently under review by the state bar for unrelated misconduct involving falsified affidavits and mishandled trust funds. His record read like a handbook of bad ethics. I compiled what I had. The metadata analysis, Ricky's audio confession, the obvious conflict of interest through his poker night connection to David, and filed a detailed, anonymous complaint with the Bar Association. I didn't need a dramatic confrontation, I needed protocol and process to do what rage couldn't. Within 2 weeks, I received confirmation that my complaint had been accepted for investigation. Quietly, the cracks widened. A few weeks later, I heard through a legal contact at my firm that he'd been forced to surrender files related to multiple questionable estate cases, including ours. That meant everything was now under scrutiny, and David's airtight will was suddenly radioactive. What David didn't know, what he never thought to consider, was that a lie built on a crooked lawyer and lazy witnesses doesn't just collapse under pressure, it rots from the inside, quietly, until it's too weak to stand at all. While the investigation into David's shady lawyer crawled forward behind closed doors, I held in my hands the one piece of evidence that didn't just weaken the lie, it detonated it. The metadata from the forged will was damning, but I knew that in court, raw data alone isn't always enough, you need context, authentication, chain of custody. So I enlisted a colleague at my firm, someone I trusted, to review and validate the digital trail. Together, we built a forensics report that not only confirmed the document was created on David's personal laptop, but also pinpointed its origin to a specific user profile, his name, his device ID, his network IP, all tied to the morning after our father's official time of death. Not the week before. Not even the same day. The morning after. The laptop betrayed him in ways he never imagined, because unlike people, machines don't lie, they log. Every time he opened the file, every saved version, every edit tracked and timestamped with clinical precision. We printed it all out, timestamp by timestamp, and placed it in a folder that felt heavier than its weight. I didn't need to scream. I didn't need to threaten. I just needed to wait for the right moment to open that folder, and when I did, David's entire story would dissolve under the weight of his own keystrokes. That moment came quietly, like all good storms do, not with a bang, but with a knock at a sunlit door. I copied everything onto a single, matte black USB drive, the forensic report, Ricky's recorded confession, screenshots of the poker nights, archived metadata logs, and the lawyer's disciplinary record. It was small, cold, and unassuming, and it held the future. I messaged Hannah one afternoon and asked if we could meet privately, somewhere neutral. She agreed without hesitation. We met at a quiet coffee shop near her office, and I slid the drive across the table without ceremony. No dramatics. No threats. Just the words, everything you suspect, it's worse. And it's real. She didn't touch it right away. She stared at it like it might explode. And then, slowly, she picked it up and slipped it into her purse like it was sacred. I explained the documents, the timeline, the digital evidence, all laid out, step by step. Her face didn't crumble. It calcified. Years of doubt, of being gaslit, of watching her husband lie with ease, it all aligned into focus. She didn't cry. She didn't flinch. She just looked me in the eye and said, "Thank you." That's when I knew the balance had shifted. David had no idea that the quiet woman he underestimated in his own home had just been handed the fuse to his entire illusion, and now, she was ready to light it. Hannah didn't scream, didn't throw plates, didn't pack bags in the middle of the night, she moved with the precision of a woman who had been preparing for a long time. Within a week of our meeting, she'd quietly met with a divorce attorney, not just any attorney, but one who specialized in financial misconduct and high-asset concealment. She opened a separate account in her own name, rerouted her paycheck, and began documenting David's erratic spending and the growing list of accounts he never disclosed to her. She copied financial records, took screenshots, pulled backup data from the shared family laptop David barely protected with a password. Every move was silent, clinical, like she was peeling wallpaper off the walls of a house she no longer intended to live in. Then, without warning, David came home one Friday evening to a cold dinner and a single envelope, divorce papers, filed and served. No dramatic exit, no tearful breakdown. Just a clean, calculated move backed by everything she needed to take their son, half his assets, and the moral high ground. And he never saw it coming. Because like me, Hannah had learned that the most devastating strikes are the ones you never hear until it's far too late. Within days of filing for divorce, Hannah launched the second part of her plan, a petition for emergency custody of their son, citing financial instability, ethical misconduct, and emotional endangerment. Most people don't realize how powerful timing and paperwork can be until they watch a man like David unravel in a courthouse hallway. She filed with precision, attached evidence of David's reckless spending, his hidden bank accounts, his falsified will, all presented as part of a broader pattern of deception that cast serious doubt on his ability to act in their child's best interest. The USB drive I had given her played a central role. Her lawyer, sharp and merciless, presented it as the digital blueprint of a man who built his entire adult life on fraud. Judges don't take lightly to forged legal documents, especially not when tied to stolen inheritance and a fake will designed to rob a sibling. David showed up to the hearing late, cocky, still assuming he could talk his way out of anything, but this time, the room didn't tilt in his favor. No charm, no jokes, no quick smiles could undo what had been laid out in black and white. The judge granted Hannah temporary full custody on the spot. And as David stood there stunned, blinking like he'd just been slapped by the wind, I watched from the back of the courtroom and thought, that's one piece down. One more thread pulled from the sweater he thought would never unravel. David still had no idea that the courtroom ambush over custody was only the first of two knives aimed straight at his spine. The second was mine. Just 1 week after Hannah's quiet victory, I filed a formal petition to challenge the will, supported by a pro bono legal team from my firm's litigation unit. I'd waited years for this exact moment, until I had airtight evidence, expert validation, and an opponent too distracted by his collapsing personal life to even prepare. My legal team packaged everything: Ricky's audio confession, the damning metadata, the bar complaint against the lawyer, and the financial trail that proved motive, method, and opportunity. We submitted a request not just to void the fraudulent will, but to have the entire estate reopened and audited, citing inheritance theft and felony fraud. And the moment that petition landed in David's mailbox, his fake kingdom began to shake. He called me, once, angry, panicked, accusatory. I didn't answer. I didn't need to. The law was speaking now, with all the cold fury I had carried in silence for years. And finally, after everything he'd taken, I was standing on the edge of taking it all back. The courtroom smelled like dust and anxiety the morning we walked in, armed with boxes of truth dressed as paperwork. My legal team, sharp, prepared, and merciless, laid everything out with surgical precision. First came the timeline, our father's date of death, the supposed will date, and the metadata proving the document was created after he passed. Then came the digital forensics report, verified, time-stamped, and tied directly to David's laptop. We played Ricky's confession out loud, his voice scratchy but damning, admitting on record that he never saw our father sign anything. The judge leaned forward with every piece of evidence, expression hardening, questions becoming sharper with each round. David tried to interject, tried to play the victim. I didn't mean, it's all a misunderstanding. But no one was buying it. Not this time. Not with digital fingerprints, audio evidence, and a lawyer under disciplinary review hanging around his neck like a noose. The moment that mattered most came when the judge asked, flatly, why was this document created after your father's official time of death? David froze. No script. No spin. Just silence. And in that silence, I felt something I hadn't felt in years, justice turning its head in my direction. Because now, finally, the truth wasn't just on my side. It was standing in court, undeniable. The ruling came faster than I expected, but not faster than I hoped. The judge declared the will null and void, citing overwhelming evidence of fraud, witness manipulation, and unethical legal involvement. Just like that, the entire estate was reopened, dragged out from the dusty vault David thought he had sealed shut forever. The courtroom was still when the order came down, and I watched as David slumped back in his chair, blinking like he couldn't quite process what had just happened, like reality had shifted beneath his feet. The house, the savings, the lake property, the classic cars, everything was now back on the table, subject to reassessment under the original terms of our father's true wishes. What David thought he had stolen outright was now frozen, pending redistribution. He tried to object, but the judge silenced him with a glance and a gavel. I didn't speak. I didn't need to. My silence had always been my sharpest weapon, and now it echoed in a courtroom that once ignored me. The system he used to steal from me was now working against him, methodically, legally, and completely. And for the first time in years, I walked out of that courthouse not with rage, but with power. Real, earned, unstoppable power. The collapse started slowly, a missed payment here, a cancelled meeting there, but then the full weight of the judge's ruling began to crush everything David had built on stolen ground. The estate freeze locked up the house, the accounts, even the boat he'd arrogantly named after himself. His brokerage firm, notified of the court's findings and the fraud investigation underway, suspended him immediately pending review. Clients pulled away. Referrals dried up. Colleagues distanced themselves with awkward silences and empty apologies. One by one, the same people who used to toast him at parties began to treat him like a contagious disease. And behind all of it, Hannah stayed silent. She didn't gloat, didn't warn him, she just let him implode under the weight of the truth. I watched from the sidelines as his social media turned quiet, then defensive, then non-existent. His SUV got repossessed. A lien was placed on the lake house he once called his legacy. His smile, once smug and effortless, disappeared from every room he walked into. And still, I didn't say a word. Because this wasn't just karma, this was consequence. And David, for the first time in his life, had no one left to charm, no script left to sell, and no ground left to stand on. When the final court date arrived, the one where the estate would be officially redistributed and damages ruled on, I didn't go. Not because I didn't care, but because I didn't need to be there anymore. David's downfall wasn't a show I had to watch to believe. I already knew how it would end, with him sitting alone in a courtroom he once owned with swagger, now stripped of the bravado, listening as a judge read out the final terms like a death sentence to his ego. My attorney stood in for me, calm and composed, while the court awarded me back my rightful share of the inheritance, every cent my father intended me to have, plus damages for the fraud, the delay, the emotional toll. It was over. The documents were signed, the transfers initiated, and David, I'm told, looked like a ghost. I imagine he glanced at the empty seat where he expected me to be, waiting to gloat, to smirk, to confront. But I was miles away by then, walking along the edge of the lake property he once claimed as his own. Because the truth is, when you've won that completely, you don't need the last word. Sometimes the most brutal revenge is your absence, the silence that reminds them they're not even worth your presence anymore. Returning to the lake house felt like stepping into a memory that had finally been set right. The porch creaked the same way it did when I was a kid, the dock still leaned a little to the left, and the air smelled like pine and justice. But this time, I wasn't a guest in someone else's lie, I was home. The title was officially in my name again, along with everything my father had wanted me to have, the savings, the cars, the land, the peace. I spent the first few weeks in quiet restoration, cleaning out the dust, repainting walls, fixing the little things David had ignored or abused in his rush to show off. I found an old photo of me and Dad in the boathouse, tucked behind a drawer, and framed it for the living room. For the first time in years, I wasn't surviving, I was living. And every board I repaired, every leaf I swept from the porch, felt like a stitch mending something inside me that had been torn for too long. This wasn't just about reclaiming property. It was about honoring what was mine from the start. The lake was calm. The house was still. And the only thing missing from it all was the sound of David's voice, echoing through something that never belonged to him in the first place. In the garage behind the lake house, beneath years of dust and forgotten tools, sat what was left of my father's pride, 3 classic cars he'd once obsessed over like they were family. David had sold the flashiest one years ago, but these remained, a '69 Mustang, a cherry red Corvette with a cracked mirror, and my favorite, a forest green Plymouth Barracuda with faded leather seats. I didn't hire a mechanic. I didn't call in favors. I rolled up my sleeves and did it myself. Night after night, with grease on my hands and engine manuals spread across the workbench, I rebuilt what David had abandoned for vanity. Each bolt I tightened felt like a conversation with my father. Each polished panel felt like erasing David's fingerprints, one layer at a time. It wasn't just restoration, it was reclamation. There was something sacred in the hum of an engine you brought back to life. And every time I turned the ignition and heard it roar, I felt more grounded in who I was. Not the quiet sister David tried to erase, but the daughter my father raised, strong enough to fix what others had broken. One night, as I sat in the Barracuda's front seat with the garage door open and the cool lake breeze slipping in, a memory surfaced with sudden, perfect clarity, David's voice on the day he first told me about the updated will. I remembered everything, the smug tilt of his head, the casual cruelty in his tone, the way he said, "This is how things work when you're not smart enough to protect yourself." He'd tossed those words at me like breadcrumbs, never thinking they'd be the seed of his own ruin. For years, that sentence haunted me, echoing every time I moved into a cheaper apartment, every time I checked my bank balance, every time I swallowed the rage just to get through the day. But now, sitting in the car he didn't even bother to touch, on land he tried to steal, I realized that echo had changed. It no longer haunted me. It reminded me who I was. Reminded me that intelligence isn't loud, and strength doesn't need applause. David's words didn't define me anymore, they defined the moment he lost, before he even knew the game had started. After that night in the Barracuda, something in me hardened, not with bitterness, but with certainty. I realized how much of my life had been spent shrinking to fit the space I was allowed, apologizing in silence for taking up oxygen in a world that always seemed to revolve around louder people like David. I apologized by letting him speak over me. I apologized by letting others believe he was the strong one, the smart one, the rightful heir. Even after the betrayal, I'd tiptoed through grief and fury as though I needed permission to feel it. But those days were gone. There were no more apologies. Not for being quiet. Not for being patient. And definitely not for being smarter than the man who tried to erase me. I didn't just survive what he did, I dismantled it. Brick by brick, lie by lie, I proved that silence isn't weakness. It's strategy. And now, as I stood on the lakefront porch with the keys to everything he stole, and lost, I didn't feel guilty. I felt whole. And that? That didn't need to be explained to anyone. The last time I saw David wasn't in court or through some final dramatic confrontation, it was by chance, in a grocery store parking lot on a gray afternoon, months after the dust had settled. I was walking out with a bag of produce in one hand and keys in the other when I saw him, leaning against a beat-up sedan, staring blankly at the ground like gravity was working harder on him than it did on the rest of us. He didn't see me at first. When he finally did, his eyes met mine for a half-second before darting away like a guilty child, no words, no nod, just that familiar twitch in his jaw that used to mean defiance, but now looked more like defeat. And I realized then that I didn't need anything from him. Not an apology. Not an explanation. Not even acknowledgement. Watching him shrink into himself without me saying a single word was the perfect ending, the kind that doesn't require applause, just a quiet, irreversible shift in power. I walked past him without stopping, the keys to the lake house still warm in my hand, and for the first time in years, I didn't feel like the one who'd been left behind. I felt like the one who'd left him exactly where he belonged. That evening, I sat out on the dock with one of Dad's old thermoses full of tea, the sun dipping low over the lake, painting the sky in burnt orange, the kind of view he used to say reminded him why he stayed out here in the first place. I thought about him a lot in those quiet moments, about what he would have said if he'd known what David did, if he'd seen how it all unfolded. And the truth is, I think he would have understood. Not just the pain or the betrayal, but the patience, the method, the quiet refusal to let it go. He raised us both, but he raised me to listen closely, to think carefully, to know the difference between pride and justice. This wasn't just about money. It wasn't even just about revenge. It was about balance, restoring something that should never have been broken in the first place. I wasn't just defending myself. I was defending him, his name, his wishes, his legacy. And in that stillness, with the lake calm and the night creeping in, I swear I could almost hear his voice, soft, proud, and certain, saying, "You did good, kid. You made it right." The strangest thing about peace is how quiet it really is, not just in the absence of conflict, but in the absence of the need to prove anything anymore. I wasn't fighting. I wasn't watching my back. I wasn't calculating. I was just living. My morning started with the sun cutting through the kitchen windows, dust swirling like gold in the light. I read books by the fireplace I rebuilt myself. I planted tomatoes out back, fixed the dock with sanded cedar, and spent evenings driving the Barracuda down winding lake roads with music low and the windows down. There were no grand declarations, no champagne toasts to revenge, no final letters sent. Just breath, just space, and a life that finally felt like mine. I stopped needing anyone to validate what had happened, or why. I didn't even check in on David anymore, not through whispers or gossip or digital trails. Whatever path he was on now wasn't mine to watch. I'd already walked through fire. And now I was somewhere better, where the quiet wasn't suffocating anymore. It was healing. Because in the end, peace isn't loud. It's the sound of your own heart, steady again. Some nights, when the wind picks up off the lake and the trees whisper against the siding, I find myself thinking about everything that led me here, not with anger, not even with sadness, but with sharp-edged clarity. People like David always assume the world forgets, time passes, noise fades, and the damage gets buried. But I never forgot. Not the sound of his voice when he lied. Not the way his eyes lit up when he thought he'd won. Not the weight of the duffel bag I carried into a stranger's basement after he took everything. That memory lives in me, not as a wound anymore, but as a scar I earned surviving him. And while David's world shrank into silence and consequence, mine grew roots. Deeper. Stronger. I don't tell this story for sympathy. I tell it as a reminder, the quiet ones are watching. We remember. And when the time is right, we move. Not with noise, but with precision. And by the time you realize what we're doing, it's already done.